Parshas Tazria is very complex, and if you're not an absolute expert at Baki and Taris and in Mitzora and all the Negoim issues with the Maranusha, you just hear the Parsha and it flies over your head. The HaChaim HaKados from 5 centuries ago and more in Sfat gives us a little bit of an insight behind the scenes, some of the messages that are inspiring and uplifting that we can take on a moral lesson from the Parsha of Mitzora. He begins, and we'll read parts of it inside, part outside. Adam kiyeh bi'ar b'sara. And Chazal derive in the Gemara in Bab Metzia on Daf Kuf Yudaled that Adam atem kuyim Adam v'yein umos ha'olam kuyim Adam, that this Parsha of Negoim is addressed to Klal Yisrael exclusively, not to the nations of the world. And the first lesson that we learn then is, on a spiritual level, is that there's something very unique about the makeup of a Jew, the distinction between Tara and Tumah, as a message to a Jew. When he contracts Tumah, this is something that is actually a gift, a divine gift to the Jewish people and only to the Jewish people, because when man messes up, well, maybe that's indicative of who he is. But in the case of a Jew, we want to point out to him that he has to do tshuva, that he has to rectify a particular sin. We'll talk later on in the HaChaim about which sins. And that is a wonderful chesed, a compassion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he gave Klal Yisrael, and only Klal Yisrael, this phenomenon called Negoim, called Tzaras, that the Mitzora gets the message that he became tummy, messed up. It's time for him to do tshuva. Adam kiyeh ba'ar b'sara. And here the HaChaim points out that it's only ar b'sara. Modia kasav she'ein tumas tzaras b'isha Yisraeli ela b'ar b'sara v'lo b'fnim. Ki ha'umos b'chinas nafsham atzmam. He b'chinas hatzaras uminam u'benefesh Yisrael b'pag'obam l'tzad ha'chet sheyechte yirshom maret tzaras b'ar ha'basar dafka b'ar v'lo b'sara she'ein tzarech b'pnimiusa. And here, the HaChaim developed a beautiful idea about the special nature of the Jewish people. And again, another further understanding of why tzaras is only applicable to the Jewish nation. It's bi'ar b'sar, it's not b'basar. Basar means the flesh, indicates that the tzaras, this phenomenon of tumah, has penetrated deep into the person's pnimiut, his inner soul. But not so. It's only bi'ar b'sara. His basar, his inner essence, never became contaminated. A Jew cannot become contaminated because the tumah is only bi'ar. It's on the outside. It's only skin deep, as we would say. It's something external. It doesn't reflect on the pnimius, on the essence, the internal neshama or nefesh of a Jew. A Jew is always pure, and that's why we say every morning, so that even though the Jew failed and he fell short, he does not contaminate his basar, his essence, his pnim. His nefesh always remains tahora. He's only externally tummy. And I know that my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik developed this idea without quoting the HaChaim, unfortunately, in great depth, and you'll see it in the Mesoras Harav that was published by Arnold Lustiger, and he compares it to the Rambam in Hilchas Gerish. But we're studying today the HaChaim HaKadosh. We understand now why, according to the HaChaim, this concept of Tumas Mitzora is not shaykh to the Umas Olam Adam, Atem Kriyim, meaning with regard to the message that's being conveyed to the Mitzora, insofar as he belongs to the nation of Israel. The message is that you are essentially pure. Your Tara is b'pnim. But we're sending you a message that externally Unfortunately, you fell short, and there's tumah that's skin deep on the R. And that's a call to man to recognize that as a Jew, he is basically pure. He's been confronted with an outer layer of tumah. He has to now purify himself of the R of his basar, the R that became tumah. And then the HaChaim points out that in Masechta Erchin, we learn from Adam that it includes afilu tino, all the messages that are inherent in the parsha of Tazria should be conveyed in the framework of chinuch from parents to children. It's very important that the child be raised with this moral standard that's very high, lofty, and demanding to avoid all the sins and the pitfalls that may have created tumas tzara. So here's a case where even a katan, he's less than bar mitzvah, but he's included in the parsha of tzara. The HaChaim goes on to point out that within the skin of man that was inflicted with tzaras, there are two categories of skin. He says there are parts of the body where ein bo tzimchei sa'oros, where normally the se'ar, the hair doesn't grow. There are no pores for the hairs to grow in. Take, for example, the palm of your hand, but there are many other parts of the body. And since all of the phenomenon, the manifestations of this tumah are in the R, and the R turns different colors, etc., then we might think that the tumah of taras is limited and restricted only to those parts of the R that normally would have hair pores. However, and that's called dafka b'makom roy legadol tzimchei seir. Avol b'makom she'ein bo tzimchei seir, hagam she'tzoach bo seir, in a very unusual yotzei dofen situation, from this area, seir came out, and it grew. And you might think that he's not going to contract tumah in those areas, because that R is not an R that yeshbo, that as a general rule has tzimchei seir. Perhaps if we could just expand a little bit on the understanding of this point, the HaChaim might have in mind is that seir, hair, grows on the skin to protect the skin. It gives warmth to the skin. And when man gives warmth to the body, I mean to say, but when man grows hairs, the hairs not only protect the skin and the body, but they also exude and project a certain warmth. When you cuddle a person in a hairy part of the body, it has a different impact. And we might have thought that the tumah of tzaras only applies when man misused that part of his personality that reaches out with warmth. It's a place where normally there is seir, and then he is a mitzvah. But if in an area where he's not interacting with other people, he may have messed up and fallen short, maybe in that case he's not tummy, or maybe on the contrary, in this case, it is irrelevant to him because it really enters into the boss. No, there's always hope, and there is always tshuva, and therefore tara. The Torah speaks about two basic phenomena in the skin of tzara, se'es and sapachas. Se'es is introduced early in the parsha, and sapachas much later. What's the difference between the two? And it has to do with the level of whiteness, which again, only the Kohen is an expert to discern. But se'es is called se'ar semer noki. It's the white fleece of a sheep. And then we have something called baheres. Baheres is a darga shnia. It's a much more intense kind of white. It's lo kisid hahecha. And at this point, the HaChaim raises the following question. If Baheres is more intense, it's a madrega gedola of Tumas Tzaras. Wouldn't it make sense in the language of the HaChaim? Kevon Shabaheresi Aza, it's very profound, Kishelim. Then in Kain Hoyalola Hakdim Madrega Gedola, the Achakach Madrego Shalamakim. Wouldn't it have made sense that the Torah would begin with the highest madrega, the most intense and obvious manifestation of tzaras, which would be a heres? Why does the Torah then change it around and start with se'es? And here the HaChaim quotes a sugya later in Erechin on Daf Tesvav. What sins brought about this manifestation, this pathological, dermatological state of tzaras? And the Gemara tells us that there are two basic sins that the Mitzorah was guilty of. One is motzi shema, which is sheker and libel. And the other is lashon hara, where he tells the truth, but it's gnai and it's derogatory. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, Keneged shnei elu omar se'es ubaheres. Se'es is keneged motzi shemra, and he quotes it from, he proves it from a pasuk in Shmos Chaf Gimel, the omar lotisa shema shov. That's a falsification of the truth under oath, but the word se'es appears here in lotisa. However, Baheres is keneged lashon hara. And this is going to give us perhaps an answer, which is a big revolution of sorts, as to why se'es comes first, even though in terms of whiteness, the more profound darga gedola would be Baheres, which should have come first. The answer is that although in its intensity on the pathological, biological level, Baheres should come first, the Torah went out of its way to put se'es first, because se'es is really the darga gedola, not physically, but morally and ethically. It's a worse sin to speak lashon hara than it is to be motzi shema. How could that be? On an ethical level, when you are guilty of motzi shema, which is sheker, sheker ein lo raglayim. Ultimately, the truth will come out, and you'll be sued for libel, and the witnesses will testify that you made up and falsified the truth, so that the damage and the impact is somewhat limited. But when we talk about lashon hara, when you're saying the truth, very difficult to undermine and neutralize the destructive impact of lashon hara, because there's no one going to say that it's false. It's definitely true, but it's derogatory, it's gnai. And you've sort of, in a sense, impinged and lowered the image of a person when you speak lashon hara about it. And that's going to be very difficult to do true. And therefore, se'es comes before sapadas in terms of what he calls in the HaChaim HaKados, the darga gdola yosef. That's a chiddush here, that lashon hara is a darga gedola yosef vis-a-vis motzi shema. One more final idea, although the HaChaim keeps going and going. Ra'o hakohen v'timos. It's the Kohen who will declare and determine whether this person is actually Tamei B'tumas Mitzorah, and it's the Kohen who will be Mitayr. Now we understand the Kohen as the vehicle of Tara, declaring that he's Torah, he's no longer Mitzorah, bringing you back into the community, because the Kohen represents Av. He is the midah of chesed, of compassion, of love, and therefore the bracha in the Nesias Kapayim of the Kohen ends with the word the Av. So certainly the Kohen is the proper choice, the best candidate for Tara. But why Tumah? And the answer is because out of compassion, the Kohen will only determine that this individual is Tameh if he's absolutely certain. And not only that, he will, as a Kohen, express and manifest the divine compassion, giving the Tar, who now became Tameh, giving the individual the right and the ability to face up to his defaults, to his limitations, to correct and rectify the Lashon Hara, etc., etc., and regain his state of power, which the Kohen is meant to bring him back to the state of power. So the Kohen is really part of an educational tool in which he begins by declaring the Mitzorah as Tameh and ends by bringing him up. The Kohen, through his education, through his impact on the Mitzorah, through going out there time after time to check out the Mitzorah, all that interaction will have an uplifting impact on the soul of the Mitzorah, bringing him, as it were, to the termination of Torah and to the level of time. Yiratzon, that we can learn and study and be uplifted by all the secret allusions and the deeper messages underneath the surface of that very technical, halachic parsha and laws of the Goyim of Mitzorah. And these ethical principles and rules that we learn not just for the intellectual enjoyment of it, but should make the impact on the soul. And we should, Amir Hashem, see in our day when Mitzorah will be reinstated and we'll be able to learn the lessons that sometimes afflict us to bring us to Tshuva Shlema. Amen. Thank you.